Gong Hei Fat Choi. Happy I think I got the first bit out. I'm so disappointed in myself. Happy Lunar New Year to everybody who's been celebrating that, particularly yesterday. I hope you had some wonderful time with family and friends and eating lovely food. And if I pronounced it wrong, please come and teach me I'd love to know how to properly do it. I think I got the pitch terribly wrong. As Julie said, we're in a series on questions that Jesus asked. And this is going to be our last one before we have a little break and we move into our Lent series on fasting. And then we're going to pick this back up again in March. But just as a little nice recap for you, we've looked at questions like, do you love me? Why do you worry? And has no one condemned you? And so now we're looking at, who do you say I am? And it's the answer to this question that Peter gives that actually leads Jesus to first forming his followers into a community of believers, or as we often commonly call it, the church, of course, today. But looking at the church of today, I'm going to level with you here. Sometimes it's really hard to see how what Jesus started back then even remotely relates to the church of 2024. It's 2,000 years of history, as many miles, if not more, far away from us. And that means that obviously things are going to look pretty different. And I think perhaps it's fair to say that the church in the West has a bit of an image problem, as numbers are declining and there's stories of corruption, abuse, systemic discrimination continually seeming to surface with quite worrying regularity. It starts to beg the question whether the church is fulfilling its call to follow Jesus as well as it should. Has it instead failed or succumbed to darkness of a world where it should have been shining a light to? And this is where Julie starts really panicking about what I'm going to say next. But this is where returning to this passage, where there's the birth of the church, can be really helpful, because it's here within Peter's answer to Jesus asking, who do you say I am? It's within that statement that Peter says he is the Messiah. That is where we're going to find what it is that keeps the church going, that keeps the church's heart beating after all this time. And I imagine in that we're likely to find some wisdom that we can apply to our own walks of faith, both as a community at St. Mike's, but also individually. So let's get into it. A bit of context. As Jeff has really helpfully said, at this point, Jesus is well into his ministry of teaching, of healing, of all sorts of things to anyone who listen. And he's generally been doing it around the area surrounding the Sea of Galilee. But now we find the disciples and Jesus have traveled up to Caesarea Philippi. So that's about 20 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. But the important thing is that actually Caesarea Philippi is out of Israel's territory, and therefore it's not within the jurisdiction of the Jewish religious leaders. And these Jewish religious leaders, they've been becoming increasingly concerned and even threatened by Jesus and what he has been saying and his ministry. And so, to be honest, it's probably quite intentional that Jesus and his disciples have found themselves in Caesarea Philippi when he's about to ask this really, really important question. Because the answer is probably quite controversial and very definitely dangerous. Now, Tom mentioned a few weeks back that Jesus loved to ask questions, but he also loved to seemingly avoid answering questions as well, at least directly. And that's because, like any good teacher, you're only as good as your questions. I'm not a teacher, so I wouldn't know that. I have it off of Tom as good source. Jesus wanted his disciples not just to know who he was, but to understand who he was. And we see this at play in this conversation. It definitely comes across as that kind of Jesus being that kind of teacher who's leading the disciples to the question, to the answer that he wants them to have. And so he starts off with that first question. People say the Son of Man is. And by the Son of Man, he does mean himself. And you could just imagine him sagely nodding as they offer these answers. John the Baptist, Elijah, I'm sure, Jeremiah, yes, other prophets. Okay, all right. They're not bad guesses, certainly, but they aren't quite what he's looking for. Because you see, Jesus is looking for a very particular answer here. Because at this point in his ministry, Jesus knows where he's heading. That this was the turning point for him, moving from ministry and teaching in different areas towards a journey that ends at the cross. And so he knows his time is limited. He knows he is heading to suffering and death, and he needed to know what the disciples really thought, who they really believed that he was. And not only that, but whether they were ready to say it and stand by it. He needed to know that when the time came, when he was no longer going to be there in person to teach or to minister to them or to others, that they were ready, that they would understand who he really is, and that their faith is going to carry them through what lay ahead, because it was going to be really difficult. And they needed to help him continue his earthly ministry. So if they didn't know who they were following by now, that was really going to spell trouble. Thankfully, Simon Peter gets it right. He gives the correct answer. He says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now, the disciples by this point have already called Jesus the Son of God. This wasn't something new. And it's worth pointing out that when they say Son of God, what they mean is they believe Jesus to have a particularly close relationship with God in the way that any king or high priest at the time would do. It wasn't the way that we tend to understand it as Christians of being God the Son. The big thing here is that Simon Peter calls Jesus the Messiah, the long-awaited king, descended from David, who the prophets have said would usher in God's kingdom, who would save and restore Israel to glory. And up to this point in Matthew's gospel, no one in the story has said that Jesus is the Messiah. We only know that as readers because Matthew's clued us in right at the start of the gospel when Jesus is first born. So it's a big, big moment. Bigger than Taylor Swift announcing her new album on Monday. When Simon Peter says he is the Messiah, he's the first person in the narrative who really says that Jesus is the Messiah, the Savior. He might not have been the first person to think it necessarily. I imagine the disciples have had a lot of chats and a lot of talk about this before he gets to that point, but he is the first to confess Jesus' messiahship. And this itself was not a revelation that Simon Peter came to on his own, by no means, nor was it something that was come to by someone else's own ingenuity. It was actually God showing him who Jesus is. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because off the back of Simon Peter's confession of who Jesus really is, Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." I'm just going to repeat that one more time. "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." I'm just going to point out some three really important things of what Jesus says here. First off, he says, "I will build my church, my church." Jesus here is establishing the new community of God, at the center of which is Jesus, the Messiah, the King and Savior. The church was founded by Jesus, and that's as much true of the church today as it was of the early church. The church we know today, with all that mess that we seem to have inherited, that is Jesus's church, the very one that he began then with Peter. I find something so exciting about that, something amazing about knowing that the church isn't merely some human organization or institution with lots of flaws. It's a community of God's people. It's what Jesus began, and he has made us citizens of his kingdom in doing so. And I wonder if we perhaps recognise that here at St. Mike's, Stoke Gifford. That this church that we're all in now, these people that surround you, that is Jesus' church. We are all his citizens. And God is at work through this community. I certainly got a more godly perspective quite recently. Somebody told me a few months ago that there has been a church here in Stoke Gifford for pretty much nearly 1,000 years. It's recorded in the Doomsday Book, which was 1086. I Googled that. Don't think that I just know that off the top of my head. But it's amazing to think that God has been at work through this church and community in Stoke Gifford long before we've arrived, and I'm sure will be well after we are gone. It's just a wonderful reminder that this is Jesus' church rather than ours. We are the community of God's people. And so the second thing to notice is what Jesus is building his church upon. Jesus gives Simon Peter that new name of Peter, and Peter means rock in Greek. And being given a new name in other parts of the Bible often is a sign of the role that that person's going to play in salvation history. And it's also often the sign of something new starting. Abram is renamed Abraham and becomes the father of the people of God. And Peter is similarly mirroring Abraham here. He is the rock, the first stone laid of the new temple. Except instead of God dwelling in a place, in a temple, he is going to dwell in the hearts of every believer in the church community. And it isn't just Peter generally who starts the church. No, it is Peter who says Jesus is the Messiah. The church is grounded in the answer to that question, who do you say I am? It's a beautifully diverse community of people you'd never see usually, brought together and united by that one thing they share in common. Our belief that Jesus is our Messiah, the one to save and bring in God's kingdom. I had the privilege a few summers ago of going to Israel, and I visited a church that's called the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. It's venerated as the place where the crucifixion happened and also a little ways along the tomb as well of Jesus. But putting that aside, when I went to the church and I was among hundreds of other Christians, the thing that struck me and the thing that God said to me was that he is not here. He is not in that empty tomb or that place. He was in the hearts of every single person that surrounded me. Those people who were from all over the world. There was an African church who had these beautiful white tunics on. There were nuns from Italy. There were Coptic priests from everywhere. And it's crazy to think that I am linked to them, that I am connected with them because we share the same faith. We together believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And that is something incredibly beautiful only Jesus could do. The final thing I want us to notice is that Jesus says the gates of Hades will not overcome the church. And so I can imagine it's fairly obvious, gates of Hades, if you've seen Disney's Hercules. Hades is the god of the underworld of death. And so this is a metaphor for the powers of death. I'm not saying Jesus had seen Disney's Hercules. That's not what I'm saying. But this church that he started with Peter who had confessed him as Messiah, it will not be overcome by the powers of death and darkness. In fact, it reflects Jesus' own victory over death that will happen later on. It's an assurance that Jesus' church will endure, and we know that that's the case 2,000 years later. It is still standing, looking a bit scruffy around the edges, but still here. God continues to work through his church in those who have gone before and those who have come after us. The church has not been overcome by powers of darkness, nor will it ever be. It will remain until Jesus' return. And in Peter being given the keys to the kingdom of heaven, there's represented a power and authority that's given to every follower of Jesus to declare the coming of God's kingdom and speak in Jesus' name. Of course, with such power does come responsibility, and also a very real temptation to misuse that power. And there's certainly times where the church as God's people has failed to follow their call to follow Jesus. When greed and power have inadvertently become the foundation of the community instead of the declaration of who Jesus is. Perhaps in those moments when the church has forgotten its grounding in who Jesus is, perhaps that when it partially falls to temptations whispered by the darkness. It's when the people of God don't know the answer to the question, who do you say I am? And so clearly it comes down to every follower of Jesus, each and every one of us, because every follower of Jesus makes up the church. We are the church. And so it matters how we respond to this question that Jesus asks of each and every one of us. Who do you say that I am? Not who does the leadership team say I am? Not who does others say I am? Who do you say I am? You can say the right things to others, but Jesus wants to know what you believe in your heart. And so in the same way that it matters to Peter, it matters what you say. Who do you say that I am?